Filippo Gigliola had spent 5 years convincing himself that his heart was as cold as the business he ran, until a flickering news report showed him the woman he'd lost, cradling 3 infants who bore his family's unmistakable porcelain features and his own piercing gaze. By every calculated metric, Filippo Gigliola was a man at the pinnacle of his power. He was the undisputed architect of the city's underworld, a man whose life was a masterclass in sterile, high-status control. He moved through a world of tailored suits, silent boardrooms, and absolute obedience, a life built on the belief that everything and everyone had a price. But that icy order had been bought with the disappearance of Lena Goldberg, the only woman who had ever looked past the boss to see the man. Outrain when a routine news segment on struggling mothers flashes her face across his screen, Filippo's curated reality suffers moral vertigo. He isn't just looking at the woman who vanished to save herself. He is looking at Mia, William, and Ava, the 3 secret heirs to a bloodline they were never supposed to know. As the rigid codes of the Gigliola family collide with a father's sudden, violent instinct to protect, Filippo must decide if he will remain the king of a lonely empire or tear it all down to claim the family he was never meant to find. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold marble, suspended 60 stories above a city that breathed only because Filippo Gigliola allowed it to. Inside, the air was filtered, silent, and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of old money. Filippo sat in a bespoke leather armchair, the sharp lines of his charcoal suit blending into the deepening shadows of the room. He was a man composed of straight lines and hard angles, a living blueprint of efficiency. At 40, Filippo had achieved the kind of success that felt like a burial. Every move he made was a calculation, every conversation a negotiation. He had scrubbed his life of spontaneity, replacing it with a rigorous, sterile order that kept his enemies at bay and his subordinates in awe. He was the architect of shadows, designing the movements of the Gigliola syndicate with the surgical precision of a grandmaster. Yet as he swirled a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid catching the dying light of the sunset, the silence of the room felt less like peace and more like a void. So he believed he had compartmentalized his heart long ago. He had lived by the Gigliola code. Power is the only family that doesn't betray you. Love was a liability he had discarded 5 years ago when the world became too dangerous for a woman like Lena. He had watched her walk away, or so he told himself, believing that by letting her vanish, he was preserving the only pure thing he had ever touched. The television on the far wall was muted, a flicker of silent images providing the only pulse in the room. Filippo rarely watched the news. He usually dictated it. But as he reached for the remote to kill the glow, a flash of color caught his eye. A reporter stood in a sun-drenched park, the banner below reading, "The hidden cost of survival, struggling moms in the city." Filippo's thumb hovered over the power button. The camera panned to a park bench where a woman sat. She wore a faded sweater, her dark skin glowing against the soft afternoon light. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face that had haunted every hour of Filippo's sleep for half a decade. Lena. The glass in Filippo's hand tilted dangerously. His breath hitched, a sudden, sharp intake of air that felt like a physical blow to his lungs. She looked weary, the vibrant light he remembered dimmed by a layer of exhaustion. But her eyes, those resilient, defiant eyes, were the same. Then the camera zoomed out. In her arms, Lena cradled an infant, while 2 others sat strapped into a double stroller beside her. Filippo leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence he hadn't felt in years. The toddlers were fair, in their skin a pale cream that contrasted sharply with Lena's deep bronze. As one of the babies reached up to tug at Lena's hair, the camera caught the child's profile. Filippo felt a wave of moral vertigo so intense the room seemed to tilt. The boy had the high, regal forehead of the Gigliola men. The girl in Lena's arms blinked at the camera, revealing a pair of piercing, icy gray eyes. His eyes. The architect of shadows was gone. In his place stood a man whose carefully constructed empire had just been leveled by a single frame of digital film. The Scotch glass finally slipped, shattering against the marble floor, but Filippo didn't hear it. He was focused on the screen, his lips parted in a silent, desperate breath. He hadn't just lost a woman. He had been a father for months, perhaps years, and his blood was currently being labeled as a public tragedy. The order was gone. The chaos had arrived. The shards of the Scotch glass lay forgotten on the marble, a glittering mess that mirrored the state of Filippo's composure. He didn't call for a maid. He didn't call for his security detail. He stood in the center of the dark penthouse, his phone already pressed to his ear, the blue light of the screen illuminating the predatory set of his jaw. The architect was back, but the blueprint had changed from business to a manhunt. Vincenzo, Filippo barked the moment the line connected. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp. I sent a timestamp and a digital rip of a news segment to your secure server 10 seconds ago. I don't want the story. I want the coordinates. On the other end, his head of intelligence, a man accustomed to the cold, late-night whims of the Gigliola family, hesitated. Boss, that's a fluff piece from the local affiliate. It just aired. Is there a security breach? There is a hole in my history, Vincenzo. Fill it. Filippo paced the length of the glass wall, his reflection ghosting over the city lights. Identify the park, cross-reference the weather patterns, the foliage, and the skyline in the background of the wide shot. I want the exact bench she was sitting on, and I want the names of every resident within a 5-block radius of that location. Now. The minutes that followed were a blur of high-stakes logistics. Filippo didn't wait for the formal report. He moved to his study, a room lined with monitors that acted as his digital panopticon. When he bypassed the usual encrypted ledgers of the syndicate, diving instead into the raw data of the city's social services. If the news called her a struggling mom, there was a trail of clinics, of grocery assistance, of the small, humiliating breadcrumbs the world forced the vulnerable to leave behind. His fingers flew across the keys with surgical aggression. He felt a searing heat behind his ribs, a mixture of agonizing guilt and a possessive fire he couldn't quench. He had let her go to keep her safe from the shadows, yet the shadows had followed him while she suffered in the light. The notification pinged. A map of the city's north side bloomed across his primary screen, a red pin dropping with lethal precision onto a small green square, known as O'Malley Park. I have the location. Boss, Vincenzo's voice crackled through the speaker. But there's a complication. The news crew filmed that segment 3 days ago. She isn't there now. And Filippo, the woman, there's no record of a Lena Goldberg at any address in that district. She's a ghost. Filippo leaned into the light of the monitor, his eyes narrowing. She's not a ghost, Vincenzo. She's a mother protecting my blood. She isn't using her name. He grabbed his jacket, the heavy silk lining feeling like armor. He didn't need a name. He knew the curve of her shoulder and the way she held her head when the world tried to break her. He walked toward the private elevator, the silence of the penthouse finally shattered by the singular, driving purpose of a man who would burn the city down just to find the bench where she sat. The black sedan glided through the north side like a shark in shallow water, out of place among the cracked pavement and the flickering orange hum of failing streetlights. Filippo stared out the window, his jaw tight as the neighborhood transitioned from working-class grit to the hollowed-out silence of neglect. This was the territory he usually ignored, the places where the city's veins bled out. He found the address tucked behind a rusted iron gate that groaned in the wind. It was a pre-war walk-up that smelled of damp concrete and cheap detergent. As Filippo climbed the narrow stairs, the fine wool of his overcoat brushed against peeling wallpaper, a stark intrusion of wealth into a space defined by the lack of it. Every step upward felt like a descent into a truth he wasn't prepared to handle. He stopped in front of apartment 4C, where there was no doorbell, only a scratched wooden frame and a small, hand-painted sign that read, Goldberg. He didn't knock. Not yet. He stood in the dim hallway, listening to the muffled sounds from within. The rhythmic creak of a rocking chair and the soft, episodic whimpering of a child being soothed. His gaze dropped to the floor outside the door. A pair of tiny scuffed sneakers sat neatly on a mat next to a bag of discount brand flour. The reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. Lena hadn't just left his world. She had stripped herself of every comfort he could have provided. She had traded his silk sheets for drafty windows and his protection for a life where she had to weigh the cost of bread against the cost of heat. She had chosen this. She had looked at the immense power of the Gigliola name and decided that poverty was safer for his children than his shadow. The architect felt a hairline fracture spread through his heart. He had imagined her living a quiet, comfortable life in the suburbs, perhaps funded by the secret accounts he'd tried to leave for her. Instead, she was the struggling mom from the 6 p.m. news, a woman fighting a war of inches against a city that didn't care if she drowned. The whimpering inside turned into a soft, melodic hum. Lena's voice, singing a low lullaby. It was a sound from a different lifetime, one he had buried under the bodies of his enemies. Filippo reached out, his hand trembling slightly as his fingers brushed the cold brass of the doorknob. He was the most powerful man in the state, yet as he stood on the threshold of this cramped, crumbling sanctuary, he felt smaller than the children inside. He wasn't there to negotiate or command. He was there to witness the wreckage his lifestyle had made of the woman he loved. Filippo pushed the door. It wasn't locked, a terrifying realization that signaled she had nothing left worth stealing, or perhaps she simply lived in a state of exhaustion where such defenses were forgotten. The hinges let out a thin, sharp whine. The apartment was small, illuminated only by the soft, bluish glow of a single-floor lamp, and the moonlight filtering through a window reinforced with duct tape. Lena stood in the center of the room, a crying infant cradled against her shoulder. She froze, her body tensing into a defensive curve. When she turned and saw the man in the doorway, the silhouette of the nightmare she had spent years outrunning, the color drained from her face, leaving her a ghostly shade of gray. "Filippo," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse. He couldn't speak. His eyes were anchored to the floor, where two toddlers, William and Ava, were tangled in a pile of faded blankets. They stopped their play to look up at the giant in the tailored suit. They didn't shrink away. Instead, William let out a small, curious chirp and crawled toward Filippo's handmade Italian leather shoes. The boy's skin was the color of cream coffee, but his jawline was a mirror image of the Gigliola men etched in Roman history books. Filippo's knees nearly buckled. He looked back at Lena, who was now clutching the third child, Mia, so tightly the baby let out a soft protest. "You found us," Lena said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a searing, righteous fury. "I changed my name. I lived in holes. I worked 3 jobs until my hands bled just to keep them away from your blood, Filippo. And you still brought your shadow into their home." "Lena!" he managed to choke out, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He took a hesitant step forward, reaching out a hand he had used to sign death warrants. They have my eyes." "They have nothing of yours," she snapped, stepping back, her eyes flashing with a light that scorched his pride. "They have my sweat and my tears. They have the hunger I felt so they could eat. Do not look at them and see a legacy. Do not look at them and see your heirs. They are children, Filippo, something you haven't been in a long, long time." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 5 years of secrets. Filippo looked at the peeling paint and the empty cupboards, then back to the 3 perfect, innocent lives he had unknowingly sired. For the first time in his life, and the boss of the Gigliola family felt the suffocating weight of a debt he could never pay back. He was a king in a room full of ghosts, facing a woman who would rather see him dead than see his ring on her children's fingers. The digital world was never truly silent. It was a vast, interconnected web of surveillance where a single image could trigger a landslide. While Filippo stood paralyzed in the dim light of Lena's apartment, 40 miles away, in a fortress of glass and chrome, the same news segment was playing on a loop. Dante Moretti, the youngest and most volatile of the rival Moretti clan, leaned into the blue glow of his desk monitors. He didn't care about the plight of struggling moms, but he was a student of his enemies. He had studied Filippo Gigliola's face for a decade, memorizing every tick of his stoic mask. When the camera had zoomed in on the toddler with the icy gray eyes and the unmistakable Gigliola brow, Dante hadn't seen a human interest story. He had seen a mathematical solution to a lifelong problem. "Run the facial recognition again," Dante commanded, his voice tight with a dark, burgeoning glee. The software chirped, overlaying a grainy photo of Filippo's father at age 3 with the high-resolution freeze frame of little William. The match was 98%. "The architect has been keeping a secret," Dante whispered, a slow, jagged smile spreading across his face. "He's been building a nursery in the dark." The leak spread through the Moretti ranks like a virus. By midnight, the coordinates of O'Malley Park were no longer exclusive to Filippo's intelligence team. The news report, intended to evoke sympathy from the public, had inadvertently become a digital map for the most dangerous men in the city. To the underworld, those three children weren't innocents. They were the ultimate leverage. They were the weak points in the Gigliola armor, a trio of vulnerabilities that could force the most powerful man in the state to his knees. In the shadows of the north side, black SUVs began to move, their headlights extinguished as they prowled the streets surrounding Lena's building. The city's balance of power was shifting. Filippo believed he had found his redemption in that cramped apartment, but he was blind to the fact that his arrival had brought the very wolves Lena had spent years trying to lose. The struggling mom was no longer a statistic. She was a target, and the triplets who had fallen asleep to the sound of their mother's lullaby, were now the most valuable and most endangered currency in the city. The architect's shadow hadn't just reached them, it had painted a bullseye on their door. Filippo acted with the only instinct he had left. He tried to overwhelm the problem with the weight of his empire. He pulled a thick, leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket, his hand moving with the same cold efficiency he used to settle territorial disputes. In the cramped kitchen, under the hum of a refrigerator that vibrated with the effort of staying alive, he began to write. The numbers were staggering, the kind of wealth that could buy the entire block, a fleet of armored cars, and a life of absolute gilded safety. I have a house in the hills, Lena. High walls, private security, doctors on call, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its habitual command. He tore the check out and pressed it onto the scarred Formica tabletop. You're leaving tonight. I'll have my men move everything. You'll never have to look at a struggling headline again. Lena didn't even look at the paper. She looked at him, and the pity in her eyes was more devastating than any bullet he had ever dodged. You still don't get it, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her exhausted conviction. You think this is about the plumbing? You think I'm here because I couldn't find a way to take your money 5 years ago? She stepped toward him, crossing the small space until she was inches from his expensive lapels. The air between them was thick with the scent of baby powder and the ozone of an approaching storm. That money is soaked in everything I'm trying to keep out of their lungs, Filippo. Will you want to fix this? You want to be a father? She gestured toward the living room, where William had fallen back asleep against Filippo's discarded $1,000 overcoat. Then you don't bring your army here. You leave it. All of it. Filippo stiffened. The Morettis know, Lena. The news report, it's out. Without my protection, you're a target. We're a target because of your protection, she shot back. She reached into the diaper bag on the counter, pulling out a small plastic rattle and holding it up like a mirror to his face. This is their world. Your world is built on the gun. You're asking me to trade their freedom for a golden cage where they'll spend their lives waiting for a car bomb to go off. If you want a seat at this table, you have to choose. You can be the boss, or you can be their father. Not sure, but you cannot be both. Filippo looked at the check on the table, a piece of paper that represented his entire identity, and then at the closed door of the bedroom where his daughter slept. For the first time, the architect of shadows saw the flaw in his design. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress, only to realize that the people he loved most couldn't breathe inside its walls. He was being asked to commit the ultimate Mafia sin, to choose the cradle over the syndicate. The Gigliola headquarters, a monolith of chrome and glass known as the Spire, felt colder than usual. In the high-altitude boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of espresso and the unspoken rot of sedition. Filippo had been absent for 48 hours, his chair at the head of the mahogany table empty for the third time in a week. To the men who sat in his shadow, silence wasn't peace, it was an invitation. Vincenzo sat at the right hand of the empty throne, his fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. Around him, the capos leaned in, their faces illuminated by the harsh, artificial glow of the city maps projected on the walls. These were men who measured loyalty and profit margins and territory gained. To them, Filippo Gigliola was an idea, a ghost that kept the other families at bay. But the ghost was starting to look human. He's in the north side again, Marco, a thick-necked man who oversaw the docks, growled. He tossed a surveillance photo onto the table. It was grainy, shot from a distance, showing Filippo's black sedan parked outside a crumbling walk-up. Not at a club, not at a warehouse. He's spending his nights in a slum that doesn't even pay us tribute. The Morettis are moving on the garment district, another added, his voice a low hiss of frustration. They're smelling blood. They see the boss chasing a shadow from his past, and they see a man who's lost his edge, a man who's compromised. Vincenzo remained silent, but his eyes were sharp. He had seen the news report. He knew about the triplets. He also knew that in their world, a child wasn't a blessing. It was a jugular vein exposed to the air. The boss is handling a private matter, Vincenzo said, though the words felt brittle even to him. A private matter is a mistress or a gambling debt, Marco countered, leaning forward until his shadow draped over the head of the table. This is a liability. Either Filippo is choosing a struggling mom over the family business, then he's already handed the keys to Dante Moretti. We didn't build this empire to watch it crumble because the architect wants to play house in a tenement. The doubt was no longer a whisper. It was a pulse. The men exchanged glances that held the weight of a coup. They had followed Filippo because he was a machine of logic and iron, but a machine that developed a heart was a machine that broke. They looked at the empty chair not with reverence, but with the cold, calculating eyes of heirs watching a king lose his mind. In the hallways of the spire, the whispers grew. The word heir was being used, but not with pride. It was being used as a target. The inner circle began to realize that if Filippo wouldn't clean up his history, they would have to do it for him. To save the syndicate, they were prepared to prune the branches the boss was so desperately trying to water. The architect was building a sanctuary, but his own foundation was beginning to crack, and the men he trusted most were already reaching for the sledgehammers. The storm that had been brewing in the city's underbelly finally broke with the sound of shattered glass and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the fire escape. Inside the apartment, the air was suddenly charged with the metallic scent of adrenaline and the terrifyingly familiar vibration of suppressed gunfire. Nero Filippo was on the floor in an instant, his instincts as a soldier of the underworld overriding the numbness of his heart. He didn't reach for his checkbook this time. He reached for the Beretta holstered at the small of his back, his movements fluid and lethal. "Lena! The bathroom! Now!" he roared, his voice cutting through the sudden chaos like a blade. Lena didn't scream. She scooped William and Ava into her arms, her face a mask of primal terror as she dove for the porcelain sanctuary of the inner room, Mia already tucked against her chest. The door to the apartment didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of a tactical breach. Two men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, burst through the frame. These weren't the messy enforcers of the docks. These were Moretti's professional hunters. And they weren't here to talk. They were here to harvest the leverage that had been broadcast on the evening news. Filippo fired 3 times. The first 2 rounds caught the lead intruder in the chest, the kinetic force slamming the man back into the hallway. The third took the second man in the shoulder, sent him spinning. But more were coming. The narrow hallway was a choke point, and Filippo was a king standing in a ruin. He realized in that heartbeat that he couldn't hold them off alone. Not here. Not with 3 infants and a woman who had no shield but his body. He pulled his encrypted radio from his pocket, hitting the emergency channel, a frequency that went directly to every Gigliola soldier, every capo, and every rival listening post in the city. It was a signal he had never used, a total broadcast that stripped away the shadows he had lived in for decades. "This is Gigliola," he snarled into the device, his eyes fixed on the door as a fresh wave of Moretti's men appeared. "I am at 1402 North Avenue. All units converge. I am declaring a total war protocol. My blood is on site. The triplets are mine. If a single hair is harmed, I will burn this city to the bedrock. Move." The silence that followed on the other end of the line lasted only a second before the city's police scanners and underworld frequencies exploded. The secret was dead. The architect had pulled back the curtain, revealing his weakness to every enemy and ally alike. By claiming them over the open air, he had made Lena and the children the center of the world's most dangerous map. Outside, when the screech of tires and the distant wail of sirens began to harmonize, Filippo stood over the threshold of the bedroom, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars of a lifetime of violence. He was no longer a man of logic. He was a father holding a perimeter. The breach had happened, and as the walls of the apartment riddled with bullet holes, Filippo knew there was no going back to the spire. He had revealed his heart to the wolves, and now he would have to show them exactly why a man with everything to lose is the most dangerous predator of all. The smoke from the confrontation still hung like a shroud over the north side when Filippo stepped out of the tenement, his hand firmly gripping Lena's. Behind them, the Gigliola soldiers stood in a silent, uneasy phalanx, in their weapons lowered but their eyes fixed on the man who had just shattered every rule of their world. In the back of the armored SUV, the triplets were finally asleep, oblivious to the fact that their names had just become the most powerful and most dangerous words in the city. Filippo didn't return to the spire. He didn't retreat to the high-altitude boardroom where his underbosses waited with their doubts and their daggers. Instead, he summoned the inner circle to a quiet, sun-drenched estate far beyond the city limits, a place with no secret rooms, no reinforced basements, and no shadows. When Vincenzo and the capos arrived, they found Filippo standing in the grass, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up. He wasn't holding a ledger or a weapon. He was watching William take a tentative, wobbling step toward a patch of clover. "Ash, the Gigliola name is changing," Filippo said, his voice carrying the weight of a decree that brooked no debate. He didn't look at his men. He looked at his son. "The syndicates, the territories, the blood debts, I am liquidating it all. We are transitioning to a legitimate holding firm. The docks will be sold. The warehouses will be cleared. Anyone who wants to remain in the life of shadows can go to the Morettis. But you will not do it under my name." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the capos. Marco stepped forward, his face flushed. "You're dismantling a century of work for a domestic life? You're giving up the crown, Filippo." "I'm not giving up a crown, Marco," Filippo said, finally turning to face them. His icy gray eyes, once so cold and mechanical, burned with a new, terrifying clarity. "I am choosing a legacy. A crown is a target. A father is a foundation. My children will grow up knowing my face. They will know my voice. But they will never, ever have to apologize for my name. The architect is finished building prisons. From now on, I build only what they can inherit without shame." The transition was violent in its own way, a surgical extraction of a heart from a beast. Over the following months, Filippo stripped the Gigliola empire to its bones, donating vast sums to the very struggling mother programs the news had once used to label Lena. He used his remaining power not to crush his enemies, but to build a wall of legal and financial immunity around his family that no bullet could pierce. He moved into a house filled with light, where the only muffled sounds were the laughter of Mia, William, and Ava. Lena remained his fiercest critic and his greatest ally, ensuring that the man who had once designed shadows never let them creep back into the nursery. Filippo would always have scars, and the city would always whisper about the boss who walked away. But as he sat on the porch one evening, watching Lena chase the triplets through the grass, he realized he had finally achieved a success that couldn't be measured by a boardroom. He was no longer a ghost in a penthouse. He was a man who had traded an empire for the right to be human, proving that the strongest thing a man can build is a future where his children never have to hide.